Hi everyone, it's Emily. So, 7 months ago, I dropped out of college, I gave away everything I owned, and I said goodbye to everyone I loved, and I entered the convent thinking that I was never going to leave again. Well, life is full of surprises, and here I am. After 6 months of intense discernment, I decided to leave the convent and re enter the world. C'est la vie. When I left the convent, everything was completely different. Because of the nature of religious life and living in a cloister, you're not always aware of what's going on in the culture. So when I left the convent, I found out that Kanye is making Christian music now. I called that one. What else? What was the other thing? Oh, before I entered the convent, I watched the World Series game when the Astros won, and when I left the convent, I found out that they cheated. So sad, unless you're a White Sox fan like me. And the president got impeached and acquitted. Found that out. And now we've got this coronavirus plague. I'm coming to you from quarantine now, where I'm doing my part to keep everyone safe. Quarantine. Now that I've had a couple months to reflect on my time as a religious sister, I wanted to share with all of you some of the things that I learned when I lived in the convent. So I'm going to do a series of videos of things that I learned in the convent, and I reached out to some of my friends and family and asked what they were interested in hearing about, and the most popular answer was silence. So what is it like to live in silence? What was it like to keep silence in the convent? And how do we keep silence in the world?
I recorded it. Hang on. That's right.
In the convent, we had the freedom of living in silence. And what that means is that we had designated times to speak and designated times where we did not speak. And it had to do with the liturgical calendar. So on ferial days, we kept silence. This was difficult for me, as it is with most people who enter the convent, because I was coming from an environment where I was constantly bombarded with noise. Before I entered the convent, I was the kind of person who would hit Spotify the moment I got up in the morning and just put my earbuds in, have a running soundtrack all day long. Or if I was having a conversation with someone and there was an awkward pause, I would say something dumb just to fill the silence because it was uncomfortable for me. Living in the world, we experience a constant sensory overload. We're just constantly being bombarded with commercials, advertisements, traffic, conversations, background noise. Most of us don't realize how much noise we live in because it's become like white noise. The great Cardinal Robert Seurat wrote a book about silence, and I have a quote here from the book. Noise is a deceptive, addictive, and false tranquilizer. This age detests the things that silence brings us to: encounter, wonder, and kneeling before God. I love this quote and everything and anything Cardinal Seurat says because he speaks truth so bluntly and fearlessly. So he says, noise is addictive and a false tranquilizer. And this is so true, and most of us don't realize how addicted to noise we are. When we're constantly filling the universe with our own thoughts and our own ideas, we don't leave room for God to work. In the convent, I began to realize that silence is actually freedom. It's freedom from the narcissism in the world, from the consumerism. Silence is the freedom to listen to God. Cardinal Seurat also said, God waits for our silence to reveal himself. So the more silent we are, the more space we give God to speak to us. Many of the saints have said that silence is the language of God. We have to remember that nothing we have to say is more important than what God has to say to us. However, if you live in the world as we do, you will eventually have to say something. And in the convent, we did have designated times for conversation as well. And one quote we would always hear is that our Holy Father Dominic only ever spoke with God or about God. And that was sort of the aim of our conversation in the convent. We spoke for the purpose of edifying our sisters and glorifying God. And if our words didn't do either of those things, then they were useless. If you go to a low mass in the old form, you're going to experience a lot of silence. And I find that that really gives me the opportunity to worship God in my own unique way. Sometimes we forget that talking itself is an act of the will, and by its nature, it will either bring us closer to God or farther away from Him. So every sentence we utter is an opportunity for grace and an opportunity to grow in virtue. Obviously, keeping silence in the convent is a lot different than it is in the world, but I came up with some ways that you can keep silence in the world as a layperson like me. Number 1, try to go a whole day without listening to music or radio or watching TV. Number 2, stop using slang and curse words. That's a form of silence too. 3, hold your tongue when you're inconvenienced. What number was I? You can compliment someone or ask them how they're doing. You can catch up with a friend or family member you haven't spoken to in a while. Try to go 1 week or as long as you possibly can without watching the news, reading the news, or keeping up with the news. Try to go 1 week without keeping up with the news. And this is the obvious one. Stay off of social media. Try a social media fast. Last but not least, this is actually the most important one to me. Attend a Latin Mass. Why? So why should you go to the Latin Mass? Well, the Latin Mass, or the ancient Mass, or the Mass of the Saints, as I like to call it, was designed for contemplation. After the liturgical reform, the active participation of the laity was strongly encouraged, and this took away a lot of the silence that the old Mass used to incorporate. One complaint I always hear about the old Mass is that people used to just go there and pray the rosary. How is this a problem? You're telling me that people used to pray at the old Mass? So the rosary is actually a form of meditation. So if you're praying the rosary at Mass, that's fine. Ooh. Think of the Holy Family. Our Blessed Mother and Saint Joseph don't have extensive monologues in Scripture. They mostly kept silence, and when they did speak, their words pointed to their Son, Christ. Do whatever he tells you. So these are just some of the things that you can do to keep silence in the world. I hope you found it helpful, and I hope you'll tune in for my next video. In my next video, I'll be talking about how to pray without ceasing. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
And how the kingdom of God is open to everyone. You know. Oh, okay. I'm gonna pretend. Okay. Emily, tell me what you just did to my pasta.
No.